The host of Joe's Great Books is Joe Sharkey. He teaches at the University of Washington, Tacoma, but is not speaking for or sponsored by the UW. Especially not this one. But then I hadn't read Pudd'nhead Wilson, or I had started, but I hadn't read it all the way through, and I got into it, and then I got to this passage.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, look, you cannot read the real story as Twain wrote it, and as it punches you in the face, unless you actually speak the word. It seems to me that word takes on almost a sacred status. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Joe's Great Books. So in this podcast, I say the N-word 5 times. Why? Because in the climactic moment of the tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson, a character uses the N-word repeatedly. The word itself, the sound of the word, is crucial to the power and even the pain of that moment. And so I read the passage as it is written. In other moments, when I need to refer to the word, I say N-word. If you don't want to hear the real thing those 5 times, then just skip it. It's about an hour and a half in, not counting the preface, and I give you a heads up about a minute before I begin. Just wait until you hear me say, "So, here's the passage. For days he wandered in lonely places." And then skip ahead at least 2 minutes, and you'll miss it. Now, I admit it worries me a little bit how people might misrepresent the show. If someday somebody watches it. Enough that I thought maybe I should bleep out the word or just skip the whole thing. Well, given the way of the world nowadays, that's natural. But that sort of timidity is one of the reasons we got into this neo-puritanical woke mess, isn't it? We censor ourselves, and we do it not because we're worried about what fair-minded, reasonable, good-intentioned people will think of us, but because we're worried about how the unfair-minded, unreasonable, bad-intentioned people might respond. And that's no way to run a country, a class, a podcast, or your mouth. So instead of trying to avoid eye contact, I decided to take a good look at it. And I would like to begin by invoking my First Amendment right to say whatever I gosh darn please. I'm sorry to get so raw. Now, I know what you're thinking. Does this hunky know what he's getting himself into? Hunky. I am a hunky. I'm a being that hunks it up. How offensive is the word H-O-N-K-E-E? No. Backspace. K-Y, question mark, return. Enter. Dictionary.com, slang. Disparaging and offensive, a contemptuous term used to refer to a white person. Wikipedia, honky, also spelled honky, like donkey, or even honky, like Fonzie, is a derogatory term used to refer to white people, predominantly heard in the United States. Oxford Languages noun, derogatory, informal, singular, honky, plural, honkies, a contemptuous term used by some black people for a white person or for white people collectively. Origin English, early 20th century, and sense, quote, immigrant from Central or Eastern European, end quote, of uncertain origin, perhaps related to bohunk. Not so bad. The Oxford Languages gives a graph of the use over time, suggesting that it peaked in popularity around 2010. Honky, please. That's clearly wrong. I have no idea how they're measuring it, but I'm pretty sure it peaked in the 70s in a deluxe apartment in the sky high. Gotta love the Urban Dictionary entry, especially the sample sentences, which I will not read. Well, however offensive honky is or isn't, we all know I can say it. I have more than one drop of honky in me, obviously. Watch me try to jump. In fact, I'm jumping my highest right now. But as I was saying, do I know what I'm getting myself into? As a matter of fact, I do. It's free speech. And that's what this preface is really about, not the N-word. Because I think there's a lesson or two here to be learned, or perhaps just remembered. Originally in this preface, I was going to try to play down the fact that in the podcast, I quote the N word. At one point, I do say I use the word, but that's incorrect. I never use it, and I won't in this preface either, if you're worried or hoping that I will. Shame on you. And even in the podcast itself, I only read it as Twain wrote it. But I was going to play it way down here because I didn't want people to think my goal was to stir up controversy, or worse, get fired, or worse, get my ass kicked, or hilariously, get demonetized. Because if that happens, joke's on you, tube. What? Couldn't make me pay them money, could they? Okay, but who am I even to talk about the N-word? Well, the answer is I am a rational animal. And it's important for us as a society to maintain the agreement that all of us rational animals have the right, the legal right, to say what words we want, even if we also agree, or mostly agree, that we shouldn't. Because a society that compels good behavior by law also prevents good behavior in principle. Because behavior isn't truly good if it's compelled. If you don't have the means to rob a bank, you don't get credit for not robbing it. If you couldn't have eaten from the tree and you didn't, well, congratulations, non-lapsarian Adam and Eve. Or as Milton's God puts it, freely they stood who stood, and fell who fell. Not free, what proof could they have given sincere of true allegiance, constant faith or love, where only what they needs must do appeared, not what they would? What praise could they receive? What pleasure I from such obedience paid? When will and reason also is choice, useless and vain, of freedom both despoiled, made passive both, had served necessity, not me. Paradise Lost, Book 3, lines 102 to 111. And in parallel with what John Stuart Mill says about unchallenged convictions, if we simply forbid anyone to make what most of us think is the wrong choice about something, then it doesn't take long before we no longer recall why it's the wrong choice. So if we take the choice away, it doesn't just prevent good behavior in principle, it also fails to cultivate responsible behavior in practice. Because if there's no choice, remember, reason also is choice. Our judgment in choosing atrophies. In the only non-literature class I teach, free effing speech in the academy, yes, very proud. In that class, we read Frederick Douglass's autobiography, which contains 3 instances of the N-word. So questions arise how we should deal with that in class. So I make it into a point of discussion. Should we just avoid those passages? No, at least one is a very important passage. Podcast in the works. So when we read the passage during class, should we say the word? Douglass spells it out, but puts it in quotation marks each time. So if we were to read what he wrote, we'd be quoting Douglass, quoting someone else. Or should we revise what Douglass wrote and insert the term N-word? Revise what Douglass wrote? That would take some cheek. So when I gave the students a PDF of the text from Project Gutenberg, I left the 3 instances of the word just the way Douglass wrote them. At a certain point, a different question comes up. Supposing we were to make these decisions as a class, who should be able to help make them? Everyone? Just the students? Just the black students? Just BIPOC students? Just non-whites? Or to use the scholarly term, the non-honkies? Well, as I tell the students, I can't imagine denying the white students or the non-black students the right to join in a decision the rest of the class is making for the whole class. After all, the premise of my classes, and of a university, whether it wants to own it or not, is the one I keep articulating here. We are all rational animals. And that's what allows us to learn together, even to have a class in which we read Frederick Douglass. It's not the color of our skin. It's not even the content of our character, though good character always helps. It's that we are rational creatures first and fundamentally. and that affords us the possibility to develop good character. You aren't born with that, says Aristotle. You have to work to acquire it. In making good decisions, rather than having them foisted upon you by some PhD, is the way to acquire it. So no, I wasn't going to tell some of the rational animals in my classes that they just don't have a say. I told them that it wasn't right for the class to take a vote on such a matter at all, because after all, it's a question of free speech and free inquiry, which means the individual isn't to be bossed by the majority. So I left those decisions to each student. Happily, the discussion seems to lead the students to the recognition that just because we have a right to say something doesn't mean that we should. For example, a truly rational honky will recognize that his experience of what it feels like to hear the N-word is much less informed than the experience of one of his black classmates or students. So an important moral takeaway of the class is the very old idea that freedom of speech is a right. But like all rights, it brings with it a certain responsibility. Thus far, the students have used their responsibility admirably. No one even quoted the word when reading those passages. Everyone, including me, said N-word. Some did choose to spell it out in their written work. Others didn't. I respected each choice. Next time I teach the class, though, I'm going to emphasize the unfortunate truth that if a student were to choose to read Douglas's text out loud as it was written, I couldn't promise him or her that there wouldn't be any trouble, even if it didn't come from me. I said before, I was invoking my First Amendment right to say whatever I gosh darn please. But as it turns out, I don't gosh darn please to say something that offends any of my black brothers or sisters, or any of my honky siblings for that matter. I do please to communicate Mark Twain's artistry, and in order to do that, I read the N-word 5 times over about 2 minutes of this podcast. If you don't want to hear the real thing those 5 times, then just skip it. It's about an hour and a half in, not counting the preface, and I give you a heads up about a minute before I begin. Just wait until you hear me say, "So, here's the passage. For days he wandered in lonely places." And then skip ahead at least 2 minutes, and you'll miss it. Last, if anyone objects to me reading Mark Twain in his own words, regardless of these carefully explained reasons, I doubt it's because you have done more to persuade the United States citizenry, past and present and future, of the evils of slavery and racism than he did. In Huckleberry Finn, he allows whites like me, most of us first as school kids, to watch Huck become Jim's friend. And that allows us to feel as if we become Jim's friend too. And doing that was an act of art and humanity and love. But if you have done more than Mark Twain to convince this nation of our cross-racial human bond, then I would be honored if you would subscribe to this podcast, President Lincoln or Reverend King. Now, here's some mostly recent sources relevant to the N-word that I happened upon this week. There are plenty more, and though I'd like to, I don't have the time to drop everything and read them all. This podcast isn't monetized, but I have a job that is. One thing I want to point out, though, is that as you'll hear us mention during the show, my guest Mike Allen and I recorded it in 2021. So JGB is not jumping on some N-word bandwagon. Honky just got busy. Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, 2 favorites, recently talked with Barnard and Columbia sociologist Jonathan Ryder about the cancellation of his class on American culture, not for using a version of the N-word, but just for referring to it. I'll put all the links in the details. My favorite quote from that podcast comes from Professor Ryder, who quotes one of his students. He says, "The second student was an Afro-Latina who said, 'That's how it was in my Washington Heights high school. There were 3 whites left in the school, and we thought they were from Mars. We got to know them and realized they were like us.'" Back in 2021, McWhorter wrote an essay for the New York Times. That's an old newspaper. titled How the N-Word Became Unsayable. In 2019, he also wrote an essay on the same topic for The Atlantic, titled The Idea That Whites Can't Refer to the N-Word. Also highly recommended, McWhorter's book of 2020, 9 Nasty Words. We watch a C-SPAN interview of McWhorter on that book in my free speech class. Talks about a poor soul who once was named Fuckbutter. Now, if you think it's silly even to imagine someone might get demonetized simply for reading Mark Twain, then you probably haven't heard about the USC business professor who got suspended in 2020 for saying a Chinese word that sounds like the N-word, but has nothing to do with it. I'll post a link to an account of the episode from Inside Higher Ed, and also to Fire's commentary on the USC Business School. Last, as I learned only recently when I heard him interviewed on the Lex Friedman podcast, way back in the innocent days of 2002, Harvard law professor Randall Kennedy wrote a book titled N-Word, The Strange Career of a Troublesome Word. His title spells it out, but I won't say it here. I promised you only 5. Kennedy seems smart, reasonable, and balanced, and differs from McWhorter and me on important points, which is how it ought to be, in dialogue, on the campus, and on the Joe's Great Books podcast. As you'll see, I misnumbered this one as podcast number 3 when I ended up placing it in the 4th position, and the sound is still pretty bad. Just imagine you're at my house, and so is the plumber, and guys mending the sidewalk, and cars driving by, and for some reason, some guy occasionally playing the triangle, and it'll all seem normal. Hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to Joe's Great Books. Today, podcast number 3, Mark Twain with Mike Allen. Yeah. Welcome back. I'm Joe Sharkey, and this is Joe's Great Books, a podcast about the great books of Western literature for the common man, the ordinary guy, and the average Joe, hosted by one of them, me. Today, we also, in addition to an average Joe, we have an average Mike, but actually he's far from average. So, just who is Mike Allen? Now, if you weren't so ignorant, you would know. But after this medium-sized introduction, you won't be. Mike Allen was born and raised in Ellensburg, Washington. He served as a Marine Corps artilleryman in Vietnam from 1969 to 1970. He worked for 3 years as a towboat deckhand and cook on the Mississippi River. Sounds a little bit like Mark Twain. He earned 3 degrees in American history, emphasis on early, a BA, an MA, and a PhD from, respectively, Central Washington State College, now University, University of Montana, and the University of Washington, that is UW Seattle, not Tacoma. He has taught for decades, including Tennessee Technological University, Deep Springs College in California, Montana State University in Billings, and for about the first 3 decades of the school's existence at UW Tacoma, from which he retired recently to his joy and my great disappointment. In addition to a host of articles, my favorite being, quote, I just want to be a cosmic cowboy, hippies, cowboy code, and a culture of a counterculture. Mike has also published 7 books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, A Patriot's History. Where's the camera? There it is. A Patriot's History of the United States, co-authored with Larry Schweikert. In 1997, he helped found the Ellensburg Rodeo Hall of Fame Association and currently helps create museum displays at the Western Culture and Arts Center in Ellensburg, where he now lives. Now, as he wrote of himself as a budding historian, quote, when I was a little kid growing up in eastern Washington state, one of my favorite toys was a jigsaw puzzle of the United States of America. I loved putting the different colored states together, learning their names, and dreaming of someday visiting them all and learning all about America. As it turned out, I've had the honor of being able to pursue a career in American history and do just that. I'm still working with that American puzzle. He is not only a sagacious historian of America, he is a superb prose stylist who blends erudition with a very American wit. He's the first professor to win both the Distinguished Teaching Award and the Distinguished Research Award at UWT. The latter was long delayed, but not for good reasons, as I could attest, but will not. And he is, and has also been, an impersonator of President Lincoln. In fact, if I recall correctly, Anthony, tech guy, he visited your class, right? What was that, 5th grade?
Yeah, it had to be.
Came in with a stovepipe hat and all that.
Yeah, 5'7" Abraham Lincoln.
If you ask me, he looks a lot more like the third participant in today's show, Mark Twain, as I suspect the introductory photo montage will have indicated. He is also a magician who goes by the name of the Wizard of Greasewood City.
I'm an amateur magician.
He is a professional. He's also a Husky, a UW Husky, who roots for the Wazoo Cougs every Apple Cup. Mike's life is full of blasphemy.
Well, that's a cultural. I'm an Eastern Washingtonian, and when you're from Eastern Washington, you root for the Cougs. You don't root for the friggin' Huskies.
You root for the college that is the furthest away from Seattle.
Absolutely.
He is also the father of 3 fine young adults, his best publications in my eye, Jim, Davy, and my goddaughter, Caroline. He is also one of the 2 guys who got me my job, which is equivocal praise, and one of my very best friends, which is not. So, Mike, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, man, that introduction was way too long.
It's true, yeah. We probably lost half of our viewership, which means we're down to 2.
Yeah, maybe I'll just quit now.
But I am honored to have you on the show, so as not to distract the fans,
well,
the multitude of fans. I'll put that down.
Thanks for advertising the book.
Well,
and incidentally, during the plague and the lockdowns, and because of homeschooling, the sales of the Patriots' History have doubled.
Well, of course, because you get the true facts of American history all in one wonderful tome.
So I got a little gas money to come over today.
Very good. So you are working on a book I did not mention because it's not published. And as I understand it, you intend this to be your farewell, your final scholarly tome. So do you want to start us off by telling us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and there's a connection with Twain and what we're going to be talking about today. But I came up with the idea about 40 or 45 years ago to do a big overview of the role of the Mississippi Valley in American life and culture and civilization, and it would be interdisciplinary was my idea. And of course, you can't write a book about all of that. It would be like 7 million pages long. And so what I did is I divided into disciplinary chapters, art and painting and literature is one chapter. Folklore, there's actually 2 chapters on folklore and popular culture. Of course, there are 2 historical chapters that cover the history of the Mississippi Valley, movies, music, etc. But the key to doing it was to just select particular stories from each discipline. So there's only 6 or 7 stories in each of the history chapters. There's only 6 or 7 featured musicians in the chapters on ethnomusicology, and 5 or 6 folkways or genres of folklore in the folklore chapters. And so it's kind of a book of stories about the Mississippi River Valley from the time of the mound builders until I say from the mound builders and the mound building civilizations to Elvis Presley, because it ends in the 1970s, approximately in the 1970s, and I avoid much of my own lifetime in so doing. And the idea is that the Mississippi Valley is the heartland, and people don't talk this way anymore. But in the 18th and 19th century, Americans didn't doubt that there was a kind of a center to the culture, a center to the civilization, and that was the great Mississippi River Valley, which drained from the Rockies to the Appalachians.
Yeah.
And just as one example, and then I'm going to shut up here, but one example of how this works is the fact that people don't often think about, but really every form of indigenous American music. I don't mean Native American. I mean indigenous Euro-American and African American music comes from the Mississippi Valley. Jazz, blues, country, rock, gospel.
Yeah.
That's just an example of the role of the Mississippi Valley. But think of politicians, presidents. Think of military actions from the War of 1812 to the Civil War, and folklore and folkways, and of course literature. The arts. And so that's the idea. And people don't really think that way anymore. But at one time, people believed that the Mississippi Valley was the heartland. One more thing. The American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, which is the professional organization of professional American historians, was originally called the Mississippi Valley Historical Society. And their journal was called the Mississippi Valley Historical Review. And so that's how intertwined with the idea of America the Mississippi Valley was, that the professional organization identified with the Mississippi River Valley.
So back in the days when you couldn't just fly over it, right?
Well, I mean, this all has relevance today as we think of the role of the heartland and the Midwest, which keeps coming up. Kind of keeps coming up. Oh, yeah. And yeah, it isn't flyover country. That's America. It's America. There are other parts of America, but certainly this is an important part.
Absolutely. Well, and you mentioned it's important in part because of literature, right? So today we are going to talk about Mark Twain and whatever else comes up. And you've said that you're going to shut up. If you do that, Mike, it's going to be an awful show because you're the pro that I brought in. You're the ringer I brought in.
When I say I'm going to shut up, what I mean is I'm going to shut up about that particular topic that I'm on at that moment.
All right, because we got more topics.
And then hold forth on another topic.
We want to talk about Mark Twain, and obviously you can't talk about all of Mark Twain in a podcast that lasts for a couple of hours. And the way in which I put together this list and had Mike Allen as on my third show, my second guest after tech guy Anthony, is I just thought, who I really wanted to be on the show. So I'm hoping to have David Morris, another guy that we worked with at UW-Tacoma, who also left me and retired. And I'm definitely trying to get my brother Mike to be on the show, and I got a list of other people that I hope are coming on soon. I picked you out just because I thought, look, this is one of the best experts that I know I can get on the show for free. And I didn't really have anything in mind. But, we talked it over, and one of us said, what about something about Twain? That would be a good mix of your history and my lit. And because I don't teach American, I teach mainly European stuff, and I love American, but that's kind of stepping on other toes if I were to try to teach that. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought how perfect a fit it is, because the first two shows, which you haven't seen yet, because we're just recording them in a batch before we release them. The first was just about what I take to be the overriding theme of the great books, which, as I said, you're all going to die. Then the second podcast with Anthony was about Don Quixote, which I just thought was a perfect place to start because it's a classic text. It's arguably the first novel. It's hilarious. It's down to earth, and it's one of the books that I like best. It's a book that's like a deep river, so that you can see some ocean on the top, but not a whole lot. And you can just, you can ride on it, and you can have a blast as just from the adventure of the story, right? But then you can plumb the depths, and the deeper you get, the more you learn. And so when you think of Twain, you naturally think of Huck Finn first, and you think of Tom Sawyer. And those books are a lot like, as Huck Finn pronounces it, Don Quixote. So I quoted Huck in the second podcast and said, if I weren't so ignorant, but I'd read a book called Don Quixote, right? And so that's why I said if they weren't so ignorant, they would already know who Mike Allen was. But now everybody does. Now you're famous. Several people know who you are because of this podcast.
Huck must have gotten that from Tom Sawyer, who probably actually did read Don Quixote.
He seems to have to model himself a little bit on Don Quixote, he manufactures his own adventures even when there's no need, right? Like when they rescue Jim at the end of Huck, right? When he can't restrict himself just to his own book. He has to horn in on Huck's, right?
Yeah, Twain really disliked some of the European authors, but especially Sir Walter Scott.
Is that right?
And so Tom often he resurrects Sir Walter Scott to screw things up.
Well, the fact that he was Sir Walter Scott probably had a lot to do with it, so that's another reason that makes Twain, and we're not going to talk about Huck Finn mostly today. Mike's going to bring in everything because that's the way Mike rolls. But it's not a podcast just on Huck Finn, and this is partly my scheme to get Mike to come back in a year and do another podcast, maybe that one mainly on Huck Finn. But you think about Huck Finn, and you've got this. I mean, it seems like the kind of book that fits the podcast, or at least what I want this podcast to be perfectly. It's thoroughly American. It's thoroughly democratic. And so it fits our pedagogy here at JGB. See, we got an acronym. We think that the best books are stories, which basically anybody of a decent intellect and interest and imagination can learn and read from. You don't have to have highfalutin theory. You don't have to be in college, for God's sake. Depending on your college class, you might not learn that much about the book anyway. This is the most important one, is that as Huckleberry Finn illustrates so beautifully, any two human beings share things that go way deeper than race or class or age or social identity. And that I think is the key to literature. That's what that's why literature works. So there are other reasons that Twain and especially Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn fit with Don Quixote in this podcast, but I'll save that for later, because if I recall correctly, you, Mike, had something to say about Twain in general and democracy, right?
Yeah. We'll call him Samuel Langhorne Clemens once. That's it. That's his real name.
There we go. Ding.
But he became Mark Twain, and that's the only way I ever refer to him in class and also in writing, because he was Mark Twain. And Twain is really the consummation of nearly a century in which the new United States of America, born in the American Revolution, attempted to create a national culture and a national literature of its own. And that was extremely difficult to do, because prior to the American Revolution, or at least during the early modern period, really all high culture, and I mean art, literature, theater, music, the great arts, came from monarchy. And that's because of something called patronage. And monarchs, aristocrats in Europe, kings and queens, dukes. Of course, Twain has the Duke and the King, which is another story. Twain loved to make fun of aristocracy, but
cut them down to size.
Prior to the American Revolution, aristocrats produced culture because they patronized artists. They brought composers. Mozart lived in court. They purchased volumes of books that had not been written yet, so that the artists would have the money to write the books. And that's what the term patronage is all about. And interestingly, we talked about this. Americans take the term patronize, and they turn it into an insult. Don't patronize me, because they're democratic.
Yeah.
And so the question was, after the revolution, how do you make culture? How do you make art and literature and theater, music when there's no more monarchy?
Yeah.
Or people to subsidize the whole thing?
Yeah.
And the answer is you somehow figure out how to commercialize the arts and make a living at it, which was darn hard in America. And so for that reason, early American writers were often newspapermen.
Huh.
And you start with Washington Irving, who goes back to the Federalist era, or Philip Freneau, and then work your way forward to Herman Melville, and Edgar Allan Poe was a journalist, and going forward to Twain.
Yeah.
There's this history of newspapermen writing books, because that's the only way they could make a living. They wrote for magazines and newspapers, and that goes up to Hemingway, and it goes into the 20th century.
You rattled off a bunch when we were chatting over this, and I remember what names you gave already, but no, you said Whitman and Irving and Twain and
Melville.
Hemingway and Melville, right?
Yeah,
So it's
Paul.
like you list all the greatest American
Yeah,
authors.
I mean, not all of them, but
and you get a big number, right? You get a high percentage, yeah.
And so we end up with a stable of writers, if you will, during the early national period, in the age of Jackson, 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, stable of writers who are newspapermen and journalists, and they wrote stories. That was their forte. They wrote short pieces of work, and they also wrote in a more down to earth style, and. And so what happens with Twain then, who really is the guy who figured out how to put together democratic culture and produce books from it, they have trouble with a long story. They have trouble with what Devoto calls sustained works of narrative, because they're used to short stories and tales and folk tales, and putting them together. They also begin to write in vernacular, which is to say they write trying to replicate the speech of the common folk. And Twain is the guy and who put together from American culture stories, tales woven together somehow, and in the language and written in the language of the common folk, and not just one vernacular. He's known, of course, for African American speech, but he could replicate all the different dialects of the Mississippi River Valley. And in Huck Finn, he says there's 7 different dialects there. And
wow.
And he did so by writing phonetically, writing words like they sounded.
Yeah.
And which is kind of hard to navigate sometimes, but that was his genius. And he was able to put that together. But he had trouble with a long story, with a sustained story.
Yeah.
And that was his struggle, because he didn't come out of that European tradition.
Right.
He came out of a newspaper man's tradition.
Well, the thing that has struck me while you were talking about patronage, and the question was, so how are you going to make a living as an artist with no patrons? And I wish we could have just, like immediately teleported, time traveled Tocqueville to today, because, here we are, we're on a podcast. And I was telling you that, we've got lights and we've got a microphone, and the whole thing cost me probably a couple $100. And so now, 2, maybe 3 people are watching us all across the globe. And, but it occurs to me, there's another thing now. Have you heard of Patreon? There's this thing called Patreon. I'm still investigating it.
Oh,
but
really?
I hope that by the time this airs that I'm already big on Patreon. But apparently it's like what it sounds. It's an online, place app where people can essentially put their wares and try to get patrons. And if they like your show, then, they can give you some cheese.
That's very democratic.
It's an absolute, isn't it perfect? It's a perfect democratization of patronage. Right?
And it's a market phenomenon. And if the stuff doesn't sell, then, it ain't going to work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's all about merit, all about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. But in this case, with a little bit of help from some rich benefactor, some magwitch, switching authors. You were talking about the way he wrote phonetically. And I was reading some passages that may or may not come up in our discussion today. And I was trying to read them just like in a monotone, just to read it the way it was, because I'm not a good actor. I'm not a trained actor, and I don't want to, embarrass myself by looking like I'm trying to act and doing a horrible job. When you read Twain and you read one of these dialects, you can't help but sound like you're imitating a character. Your voice just takes over. The phonetics just take over. So if I read and it sounds like I'm trying to act, I'm not. It's Twain's fault.
Yeah, it's most linguists agree, pretty good. And of course, we don't know what people sounded like in the 19th century. There were no tape recorders. Yeah. Duh. But and so there's no, it's difficult to prove scientifically that he was accurate. But most linguists rely on him and others who wrote in dialect or in vernacular. They rely on them to figure out how people might have sounded in the 19th century.
Yeah, I get that.
And we see evidence today, even vestiges of these the words and the phrasing.
Yeah, the vernacular. I would love to get into the language, get some linguist like John McWhorter or somebody who really knows it, and have him take us through a few lines and see if there are any traces. Okay, so podcast 3.5. Twain, Allen, and McWhorter.
Oh man,
Sign
me up.
Give me a call, Dr. McWhorter. The other thing you mentioned was the way that they got around, or they made the transition from being newspapermen to being artists or to being novels. And part of that was, I mean, we can see it in Twain, and I highly recommend the Burns documentary on Mark Twain, two-parter.
Me too.
On PBS. I just watched that the last couple of days, and it's like a typical Ken Burns thing, high quality, excellent, very, very engaging, lots of great pictures of a guy who looks a lot like Mike Allen. And you learn a ton. And what I saw there, I mean, plenty I didn't know because I'm hardly a Twain scholar, but he had a really good time writing some of his newspaper articles, right? And there's one time when I think he seems to be writing copy or an ad about a talk that he's going to give. Yeah, and he has these big headlines that says something like "Professional New York Orchestra in town, but not engaged for this event," and "Fireworks are very enjoyable, but better on 4th of July." And so he was essentially writing some fiction while he was writing.
Oh yeah, and jerking people around, you know.
It was like it was like an 18. What would that have been in like the 1880s? Yeah, 1880s version of The Onion, but in your face. And so
yeah. then newspaper and magazine, we should stress.
Well, that was the thing I was going to go to next. And I don't remember exactly how it goes, but they did a lot of times they did novels in serial form, right? And so it was just like the next month's or week's magazine would come out with another little bit of the adventure, right? So,
and then when you're done, you paste them all together and sell it as a book.
So, and that reminds me that one of the things you want to talk about today was how to make a book, and that's where we get into at least partly into one of the books that we do want to talk about today, which is the Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson. But so I'll let you take it from here, Mike. How did Twain make a book?
And this is going to take a little while. So I'll just tell you that at the outset because I want to do this and get it right.
Good.
And we'll start with using the verb make or to make in describing the creation of a work of art, because that's ordinarily you would use create, the verb create, render art, produce art, create art. But in Huckleberry Finn, Huck is the voice of the book, and at the beginning and the end of the book, he talks about making books. He says, "You don't know me." And this is the first line of Huckleberry Finn. "You don't know about me." I'm not quoting this exactly, unless you know a book made by Mr. Mark Twain.
Something like, "But you had read a book by Mark Twain."
I can't speak in vernacular. And so a book made by Mark Twain, which is an unusual kind of construction. And then that keeps showing up. But at the end, and this is like one of the last sentences in Huckleberry Finn, Huck says, okay, that's the end of the story. And if I would have known how hard it was to make a book, I never would have started in the first place. And it's the kind of thing that could kind of go in one ear and out the other. When you think about it, it's a funny way to describe the artistic process. And it's very democratic and American. Americans make things. Democratic people make things. They don't create. We're high and low culture.
Or inherit, right?
Yeah. And in low culture, you make stuff.
Yeah.
And so Mark Twain made books. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how he made a couple of books that are... and I mean, he made them. He had to move and shake things around in order to paste things together and literally create these books. And we'll start with Life on the Mississippi, which is his kind of like what I'm trying to do with my book. Life on the Mississippi is his big overview of the Mississippi Valley and its role in American culture, published in 1874 or 75. And one of many books that Twain produced in order to try to make a living, and did so by recycling other material. And what they say about Twain, he never published anything just once, or he tried not to publish anything just once. Tried to publish it 2 or 3 times because you get paid 2 or 3 times that way. And that's not plagiarism; it's recycling. He wrote that stuff, and he sold the article, the famous essay, which is the condemnation of James Fenimore Cooper, called Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses. He published that 5 times in different versions.
It reminds me of a line you used to say at departmental faculty meetings when there's almost never any levity there, Mike. Whenever there was a vote, Mike would always say, "Vote early." And often. So Twain, he published early and often.
And, and without shame. And so the deal on Life on the Mississippi was he had written 7 really good magazine articles about his years as a steamboat pilot on the Mississippi River. And I forget where he published it. I think Atlantic. I'm not positive, but William Dean Howe was the editor of the magazine, and so and they were very popular. He published them in the early 1870s, and so he had these great, and there were quite a bit of material there, and so we thought, well, if I could use these articles and my experiences as a steamboat pilot as kind of a basis for a book about the Mississippi Valley, then I would have a book and make some money. And so we started with the articles, but then they were from the late 1850s, his years on the river. So he had to cover 200 or 300 years of Euro-American history prior to that. So he wrote 2 chapters about the early history of the Mississippi River Valley.
He's backfilling.
And largely from a Euro-American perspective, not very much about American Indians. It was about French and Spanish and British explorers. And so he got that over with, Okay, he got to the 19th century, covered 200 years or 300 years of history, and then he got to the 3rd chapter, and he wanted to do something before steamboats, about rafts and flatboats. And so so he had a little section in Huckleberry Finn that he'd been writing about Huck on a log raft, and he hadn't published Huckleberry Finn. So in this case, he's not recycling; he's stealing from a book that he's working on and puts it into Life on the Mississippi, which he published earlier, which led to all kinds of problems later because he had to take it out of Huckleberry Finn because they said you can't use this again, and it led to all kinds of plot complications in Huckleberry Finn that were never quite resolved. But we'll get to that later. Anyway, so he's got 3 chapters now. Okay, we're 3 chapters in. Now you paste in those 7 magazine articles. But divide them into smaller chapters. He ends up with 18 or 19 small chapters based on the original 7 magazine articles. And so now he's into the 20s. He's got 22, 23 chapters, and he's made it to the Civil War, which is when he ended his career on the Mississippi River. He stopped. He was only a pilot for 3 years.
Oh, right. They in the Burns documentary, I think it's James Earl Jones who's doing the narration, the main narration, right? So for the youngsters in the crowd, Darth Vader, right? And he says something about he thought about fighting in the war, or he enlisted for about 5 minutes, and then he skedaddled.
Yeah,
right?
He was in a Confederate militia unit for about 6 months.
Okay, that's what it was. Yeah,
and he got the hell out. I mean, he's a deserter.
Yeah, wow.
He went out west. Well, the militias were so informal. I would say he just left.
That's the impression I got. It was like a bunch of buddies. That if they're not playing poker, they're going to go fight.
Yeah, he left, but he did write a serious article about it called "The Secret History of a Campaign That Failed," because he was involved in the shooting and death of a Union soldier.
Wow.
And highly recommended. Okay, Secret History of a Campaign That Failed.
Yeah, wow.
Well, anyway, back to the Civil War. Twain quit steamboating during the Civil War, and so now how do you make the rest of the book? Well, his idea was I'll return to the Mississippi River in the 1870s, and I'll take a trip up and down, and I'll write about what I see, because he was a travel book guy. He had written a travel book about Hawaii. Yeah. He wrote The Innocents Abroad about traveling through Europe. So I'll take I'll go on a steamboat for 3 or 4 months, and that'll be the last half of the book.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'll call it Life on the Mississippi. And so he wrote 40. I guess it was the last 2/3 of the book, really. About 40 new chapters, and frankly, they're very checkered. There's some really good ones. He describes Vicksburg during the Civil War. Excellent chapter. He's got some nice pieces in there. He's got one on funeral parlors and embalming. Yeah, that is just fantastic.
Oh, wow.
And if you're saying, what's that got to do with the Mississippi River? Well, there are funeral parlors on the Mississippi River. And so he wandered around. I mean, literally on the river, he sailed upstream and then downstream again. And he wandered around, and he wanders around in his literary work. And finally, he writes 40 chapters, some of which actually sound like the Chamber of Commerce talking about all the great sights to see in Dubuque, Iowa, and and it's spotty, but there's some good stuff in it.
Well, there is one that I remember. I read this decades ago, but there is one that I thought was really beautiful, and I'd forgotten that it was kind of pieced together as you're describing it, right? But there's this one beautiful passage about getting to know the Mississippi River too intimately, and he compares it to a doctor who gets to know the female form too medically, too technically, too sterilely, shall we say?
Yeah.
And he said, "There's something tragic in getting to know something that well." But I mean, he seems able to wax poetic.
Well, you lose his point. You lose the beauty of the form when you get to know it that minutely.
Yeah, when it gets technical, right?
Like a pilot.
Yes, like a pilot. Yeah, so that's beautiful.
There's good stuff in there, but
there are highs and lows.
I was surprised when I first read it. I was surprised that I thought everything that Twain did was perfect. Because I didn't know, and I was thinking, well, this isn't that good. But then you ran into something that is, but one more thing about Life on the Mississippi. By the time he got done, finally, and the last chapter is just horrible, and it's an Indian legend of some sort, and it's just awful and fairly offensive. And so he finally got done, but then he wasn't done because back then people bought books on subscription. And they expected a certain number of pages.
I was going to ask him. So it's not done.
That's also democratic. I'm paying this money. I want 600 pages of prose here.
Exactly, right.
And so
quantity. It's the Costco approach to writing novels.
He ended up appending newspaper articles to the end of Life Mississippi. And one of the articles about one of the great floods, he didn't write. It was some other guy's newspaper article. And so I spent way too much time on that. But anyway, that's how he put that book together. And I'll do Huck Finn now, which is a little briefer, but and did not recycle magazine articles.
Okay, so we're step up from Life on the Mississippi, but we're still not at the apex of.
Huck Finn. The first third of the book is fantastic.
Yeah.
Because he started out to write a sequel to Tom Sawyer, a children's book or for young adults. And then, and remember, Twain wrote about America before the Civil War, but he was writing during a period of time after the Civil War.
Yeah.
And so and you can't ever forget this. Twain was writing during a period of time that everyone was figuring out that freeing the slaves wasn't the end of the problem.
Yeah. That
it was a step in the right direction, that it was a great accomplishment, and a wonderful thing, but that the problems were not going to go away. That now there were new problems. And so Twain, as he saw that, as he was writing Life on the Mississippi and returned to the Mississippi Valley, he began to renew his work on a book that he had trouble finishing, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It started out as a sequel to Tom Sawyer, but then he came upon this idea of a young boy and an escaped slave floating down the river together, freedom, and the boy, an ignorant village boy, who was raised by a racist father in a racist slavery world, that this boy could discover, as a teenager, that this black man was human and that he was worthwhile and that he was his friend and that he needed to help him out somehow and go against the law and all the conventions of society and break the law and help this guy out.
Yeah.
Fantastic idea. I mean, I'm sorry, hear it, beat your stove, eat your heart out. Uncle Tom's Cabin doesn't hold a candle to Huckleberry Finn. Yeah. I mean, it's nothing. It's a pot boiler. Huck Finn, geez. What? And the first third of the book is fantastic. They're floating down the river, and they're becoming friends, and they're in nature, and it's just beautiful. And you suspend disbelief because there's a lot of things about that doesn't make sense. I mean, if they wanted freedom. Actually, if you're in Missouri, you swim across the river to Illinois, which is a free state. That's the fastest way to be free. And forget that. Twain wanted a voyage, and so they go down the river and they become friends. But then their raft is chewed up by a steamboat in a culminating moment, and Twain didn't know where to go from there.
Right.
And he put it down for 3 years. This was like 1875 to or 1876 to 79, and he began to write Life on the Mississippi and fooled around and tried to figure out how he's going to finish this book, which was a great book up until that point. And frankly, in my opinion, he never really got back to the greatness of that first third of the book, but he did finish the book. Yeah. And he did it by beginning to patch together a series of related stories that were woven together by Jim and Huck's voyage down the river, in which they meet characters and different people and have adventures. And these characters that they meet are all from the shore, and they all bring the evil and the sins of the shore onto Huck and Jim's raft. And it begins when the steamboat chews up the raft. That's the culminating point. And then Huck swims ashore, and he ends up in a feud, the Shepherdson-Grangerford feud between two feuding families. Right. And then he gets back together with Jim again, and they sail further, and they meet the Duke and the King. Right. Twain loves spoofing aristocracy, and so he tries to pass these two loafers off, or they try to pass themselves off as European aristocrats. Right. And Huck and Jim are not real educated guys, and they actually let them get away with it for a while. And the Duke and the King are horrible. I mean, they sell Jim back into slavery. They are awful characters. They try to, and I'm talking about the different adventures that they have. They try to steal the Wilkes sisters' fortune from them. Yeah. And Huck prevents that from happening. And so there's all this, all these little stories. And incidentally, during these stories, they keep sailing further south, which is also not a good idea when you think about it. If you're trying to go to, because remember Cairo, they're going to Cairo. Yeah. Well, they pass Cairo. Good. They're down in southeast Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee. They end up in Arkansas. And so the reader, again, has to suspend disbelief and just think, well, I guess they're still trying to be free, even though they're continuing to sail south. And they're having all these adventures, and it's kind of interesting. But finally, Twain had to end the thing. And I think he committed probably his greatest artistic sin in his career by bringing, finally, to finish Huckleberry Finn, he brought back Tom Sawyer.
Right. Now, this is the part where, am I right? Ernest Hemingway, who said that like all modern American literature goes back to one book by Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn. But he also said something like, the part where that you're identifying. Tell me if I'm wrong. That when Tom Sawyer comes in, says, before that it's just a masterpiece, but after that it's just cheating. Is that the way the division, right? And
so I don't agree that Huck Finn is as great as people say it. I think it's great. I love it. I assign it. I'm the only professor at UW-Tacoma, to my knowledge, that has ever assigned the adventures. And I was there 30 years, and I'm the only professor who's ever assigned the adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
No comment.
But it's flawed, and I think the great flaw is the ending. And many people like it, fine, and it works. It's okay. But Tom comes back. He has not appeared really since the third or fourth chapter of the book, and he comes back, and he concocts this wild scheme to free Jim, who is, as I said, the Duke and the King had sold Jim back into slavery, and Tom concocts this wild scheme to free Jim using the Count of Monte Cristo as a guide, and it's fairly painful.
Well, Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I haven't read it in a while, but I'm pretty sure that what happens at the end is they get to the end, and kind of the big revelation of the punchline is that Jim has already been freed because his owner has died and freed him in her will, and Tom knew about that.
Oh yeah, it's not playing a trick. They don't think they're playing a trick on Jim. But the Jim we met in the first third of the book and the friendship of Jim and Huck is gone from that portion. Huck, okay. In the original Huck we met in the first third of the book never would have let Tom do that to Jim.
Okay. Well, it's kind of like what Twain did, right? When he has them sail down south instead of just sailing, laterally instead of vertically all the way down to the center of the earth, because he wants to have a game. He wants to play. He wants to tell a story, right?
And he wants them in nature. Yeah. If any of us today were asked, how would you end this book? we would say Jim plays a major role, play a major role in making himself free, and Huck will be there helping him, and that will be the end of the book. But
Yeah.
in the late 19th century,
Yeah.
Mark Twain ultimately couldn't do that.
Yeah.
And I always say he blinked. And so he brought back Tom, and they finished the book that way. But it's got a great concluding chapter.
Yeah.
And Huck says he never knew it would be so hard to make a book. And if he would have known, he never would have tried it. And anyway, he's going to escape to the territories because Aunt Sally's trying to civilize me, and I just can't stand it. And so it's a nice conclusion to the book. But that's how Twain made the book. Then he starts out really good. The first third is fantastic. They get to the steamboat wreck. Yeah. Then he starts bringing in characters like the Duke and the King, and the family feud, and the mob scene with Colonel Sherborne and the Wilkes sisters, and finally he brings in Tom Sawyer, which is the last 20%. And I spent too long on that, but that's how he made that book. He literally constructed it. You can see him putting the bricks together.
Well, so I was mentioning last night another way in which Twain's books, especially Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, are like Cervantes. There's something called a picaresque adventure. And in Cervantes' day, there was this very famous book called Lazarillo de Tormes. It goes back to like the middle of the 1500s. Cervantes publishes his book in 1605. And at that point, there really wasn't a modern novel, not what we would call a modern novel, although I think that when Don Quixote was published, that was the birth. That's when it came into being. But one of the precursors is this picaresque adventure. And it is a lot like Tom, just following along a character like Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn. The adjective picaresque comes from picaro, which is a Spanish word, and it just means like rogue or scoundrel, usually kind of a lovable sort. And usually it's a kid, usually a poor kid who's just trying to make his way in the world, and all he does is go from adventure to adventure to adventure, and he just survives by his wits. And so, if you know Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn, you know that that's basically, or at least there's a strong dose of that. But what everybody says when they make this comparison, and it's smart to do so, is that the Picaro doesn't really change. He doesn't really evolve. But we expect evolution or character development in modern novels, and Huck does evolve, right? And there's that. I mean, I don't want to kind of spoil it because I just want to bring Mike back to talk about Huck Finn later, but there's that beautiful moment when he's thinking about turning Jim in, right? And he has just that beautiful moment. I can try to paraphrase the line, but I'd probably botch it. Do you remember how it goes? It's like he's thinking, okay, if I don't turn in my friend Jim, I'm going to hell because it's a great sin. He's property. He's stolen. I've been aiding and abetting him. And if I help him go free, I'm damned, right? And then
God believed in slavery. He'd been raised up to think that God wanted slavery.
Yeah.
I mean, everything's upside down.
So he essentially he forfeits his own soul, and he says something like, I'll go to hell then. I think is basically how the line goes, right? This beautiful line.
I'll go to hell.
Talk about a character evolution, right? So Picaros apparently don't do that, but. Anyway, now I went on for too long. I'm talking about
it's fun talking about Huck Finn. How can you not? Yeah. You can't summarize it.
Yeah.
And it's a great book. But I just want to, show that there's some problems there too.
Yeah. Well, so that's part of the problem, right? Is that it's kind of pieced together, right? And it seems like he's kind of pumping air into the tires. It makes me think of a very small percentage of my students who can't quite get to the bottom of the page minimum.
It took 7 years. It took him 7 years to write the book.
Well, and I don't want to get too far off the top, but because I know we want to go to the next rung up of bookmaking. But how much of that do you think? And I'm going to throw a couple things out just to throw them out, and we don't have to talk about them now, but maybe they'll come back later. How much of that do you think is the same reason that, say, Goethe, who wrote Faust, right? Famous. He was happy to be known as the German Shakespeare. So. He died 1832, and he wrote the most famous version of the Dr. Faustus story. And that was something that he started writing when he was very young. He wrote little fragments, and then he would come back to it over the years, and then he finally finished part 2 just before he died. that it makes me think, okay, that's because that was the real center of his art, right? That was what was his great work, and he had to wrestle with it, and it was hard to put it together, but eventually he pieced it together, and he achieved something that was great, even if it wasn't the most polished. So, do you think there's any part of that in Huck Finn, or do you think that I'm dressing it up too much?
No, I agree, but there's one more thing. He's trying to make a living.
Okay.
He's trying to support a family, and so he's got a magazine deadline, and he agreed to publish his Life on the Mississippi, and he's got other stuff going on, and so he can't get back to it. And but on the artistic side, he can't figure out how to finish the book.
Okay, because this is one thing that Anthony, who's carefully monitoring our tech off stage, he might be interested in, because I don't know if you mentioned this when we did the podcast, but Anthony's big into novellas. So he's written a novella, and he thinks that the novella is a really, how shall I put it? It's an art form or a literary form that should be on the rise, partly because it's short and because everybody's so damn busy now, right? We're all trying to finish our life on the Mississippi and make a living and all that, keep up with the news and, everything else, and, not die of plague. And so, shorter works, it seems to me, novella basically being somewhere between a short story and a novel, to use a simplistic definition that Anthony will probably groan at. But there it is. But the shorter it is, the easier it is to polish it and to make it, to minimize flaws, make it perfect. Aristotle in the Poetics, we happen to be, I'm teaching a class where we're reading the Poetics now. And he says, he's talking about tragedies, but he says, just as with beasts, you have to have the right size for a story. And you can't have a beast that's so large that you couldn't take it in with the eye. But if you had one that was so small, like, something microscopic or a gnat, couldn't appreciate its structure or its form. And so you have to have a tragedy. It's just about the right size, which is exactly that big. And so for a novella and a short story, you can do that. But if you ask anybody who really loves literature, what's their favorite work of literature? And I have no idea what the percentages would be, but I would imagine that it would be, 90% would say novels, or at least some really long form, right? I bet the same percentage would say, they'd choose an epic poem from Homer rather than they would, a really exquisite lyric poem that's that short. But you look at the novels, and especially some of the greatest novels like Don Quixote, which none of the viewers are so ignorant as to have not read because they did it in preparation for podcast too. It is just full of waste material. It's rambling. It meanders. I mean, for God's sake, it's not that you would need to take a scissors to it. You would need to take a machete to it to make it perfect. But you finish the book, and it's just something I'm thinking about. I was thinking about it in light of the difference between Huck Finn and the next book you're going to talk about, which is
that's where we're heading.
What is it about all the waste and the flab and the fat that, why are we so willing to excuse that? And I'm starting to think that maybe there's something to the waste and the flab, and just the time that we invest in it that kind of grabs hold of us. It's like, because we put in so much work that even though it wasn't all pleasant or wasn't all rewarding, wasn't even all artistic, that, we think, well, shit, I spent 2 weeks or a month reading that son of a gun. That must have been, that was a bigger achievement on my part, and must be much better than this tiny little, polished and, artistic, short story. So I don't know. I'm just throwing that out to see what you do with that. But I'm going to throw it back to you now, and we're going to go one more rung up, right? We start off on Life of the Mississippi, which is like a pastiche and, stapled together, and then Huck Finn, which was pieced together. And the next one is?
Pudd'nhead Wilson.
Pudd'nhead Wilson.
I need a little bit more water here, as it turns out.
Thank you, Anthony? Sir. Thanks, brother.
Thank you very much.
I'll get some later, thanks.
Well, yeah.
I like to do it this way, incidentally, because people who've watched the show know I got the idea to do the show by watching the Joe Rogan Experience. And when a guest has to go to the bathroom, he won't stop it. He has the guy go to the bathroom. And then as Rogan says, okay, go ahead, man, but we're going to talk shit about you. Right? So fortunately for Anthony, he's already back with the water. So we didn't even get to start.
In the book I'm working on right now, well, actually the manuscript is completed, but I point to Pudd'nhead Wilson and say, actually, and people complain about Twain, and Twain has been banned from classrooms. Huckleberry Finn has been banned from classrooms because of concerns about race and the language of race, and Twain should never be. People need to read Mark Twain. My God, and especially in public universities and the public schools, which is where it's being banned. They need to read this, and a lot of the aspersion and criticism is directed at Twain that he's somehow a racist because he uses this language. And these are people, and these criticisms come from people who have never read Huckleberry Finn. They've never read Life on the Myth. They don't know jack about Mark Twain, but they say,
but they know it uses the N-word.
Yeah, and they're offended by that language, and and I understand that, but what did Bill Maher say? We need to. It's not BC and AD for dates. It's a BM. What happened before me? And Twain is BM. It's before me, and so in the 19th century things were different than they are now. And if anything, reading Huckleberry Finn and seeing that kind of language, you say, boy, things are really a lot better now. People don't talk that way anymore. Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, they're better.
Yeah.
So Twain was, he was a product of the 19th century, and he was not a racist. He wrote the greatest anti-slavery novel of the century, if not of all times. But people have trouble with it, and they ban it. And so that's why I was going to talk about Pudd'nhead today.
Well, and I want you to do that in a sec, but I wanted just to seize on the way you put something. It was nice that he was a product of the 19th century. But, the premise of the way I teach, and I think the way you teach, and probably the way you do, the way you teach lit, but the way you do history, I think, as well. And I think even just your worldview is that people are a product of their age, but they're not only a product of their age. If we're all products of our age, then there would never be any change, right? The age would just consistently
ages
meld us into one big long age. But people push back, right? And Twain pushed back, and so even when he is speaking in the vernacular and dealing with the issues he's dealing with and using the N-word repeatedly, because I read Pudd'nhead Wilson for the first time just in preparation for this podcast. I do my homework. And there are passages, and we may read one of them later, where he makes the use of that language and specifically that word. He makes very artistic, compelling, moral use of it. And if we get around to it, we'll see. But it's important to know that he used that language, even if you don't want to say it, because I think you told me that you managed not to say it, or you didn't manage not to say it.
Over the course of my career, I changed basically. When I first started teaching Huck Finn, we read passages verbatim, and because I thought that's what the book was, and I thought we had to read the book and talk about the book. But in the 90s, I started getting a lot of pushback. And from all over the classroom, a wide variety of certainly black students, but other students as well. And frankly, a lot of students who I really liked and respected were pushing back on me. Yeah. And as I told you, my choice was to not assign the book anymore. Yeah. So because it led to all kinds of problems, and I had to talk to the program director, and people would talk to the dean, and and the easy thing to do would just not assign it anymore, which is what everyone has done.
Right, just dodge it.
Yeah. And then the other extreme is to just keep doing what I was doing. And what I finally settled in on was going into the book and working real hard to identify passages. And then having the students read the whole book and making sure they did, and making sure they knew passages where there would be offensive language and things they ought to pay attention to. But in class, not asking them to read any of those. I never made anyone read something that they felt awkward about reading or that they were uncomfortable with. And if anyone was going to read it, it would be me. I'd be the guy who read it.
That's the way to teach. Don't leave me hanging. Just me. No, I love that. And I love the fact that you pointed out how you kind of changed with the times, because, it would be tempting to, go all hog free speech and just fight the man and say the word and all that. And if we do say it later today, we won't force it. It won't be to say it. It'll be to stay true to what Twain wrote, because there was, again, doing a little bit of prep for this, I read that there was an edition that was put out by a publisher of Huckleberry Finn that was, at least according to the editor, designed to prevent or to diminish what you talked about, people just not buying the book and not teaching the book, because specifically, let's be frank, of the N-word. And so what they did is they substituted every instance of for every instance of the N-word, they substituted in the word slave.
And so the nouns were switched.
Right.
And slave appeared throughout the book. Right. And that's a horrible way to teach Huck Finn, because if Pudd'nhead or Huck Finn, and we're going to do some reading today, when we read these books in 2021 and we read that language, it's shocking.
It does. It's like a jab. It's like a punch.
And it's a punch in the gut, and that's why it's so powerful.
Well, that's exactly it. And so you read that passage, like I'm thinking of a couple of passages where the word is repeated, and it builds up a kind of resonance and a kind of, I would say it's fair to say, a kind of pain. And if you put in any other word, it doesn't have it. The ugliness is part of the art. And that you see that in all sorts of different works of art and all sorts of different writers, some of whom we'll get to. The one that jumps out at me right off the bat is Dante when he writes about hell. It's all about the ugly. And if you don't see that and you don't kind of wince at that, be revolted by that, then you're not quite getting it.
And I think the listeners are going to know what we're talking about as we go along here. And many of them already do if they've read these things. But as way of introduction to Pudd'nhead, and I think a lot of people haven't read Pudd'nhead Wilson. And
I hadn't.
And that's why I wanted to talk about it, because it's really good. And it's really, in my opinion, it's Twain's greatest book about race, which I think he does a better job dealing with race and the evil of racism in Pudd'nhead Wilson than he does in Huckleberry Finn. And I've gone to great lengths to describe all the problems of Huckleberry Finn. Yeah. There aren't that many problems in Pudd'nhead Wilson. It is clean as a whistle.
Can I quote you on that? Can I quote you from your manuscript? I got it right here.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So here's a passage from the manuscript of the unpublished book, and puts it in typically Mike Allen language. This is about Twain, or about Huckleberry Finn versus Pudd'nhead Wilson. So he's making the transition. So I should have brought this in a little bit before you got on a roll again. But he says, Mark Twain's modern critics, including those crusaders who seek to ban Huckleberry Finn from the public schools because of its racist language, ought to spend a few hours with another one of Mark Twain's books. Hasn't named it yet. He's building up the suspense. Though seldom read, this book is pithy, impeccably drawn, authentic, and that's, if you read it, I think you'll agree. I do. But he goes on and somehow manages to present an even harsher indictment of racism and slavery than Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So, end quote. That is a heck of a proposition. And so now, Mike, go ahead, as you were, try to convince us of this blasphemy.
Well, let me give a pithy summary for the educated but uninformed listener, because not very many people have read Pudd'nhead Wilson, and the book is based on a historical fact of the late 19th century that's referred to as the one drop rule. And you may have heard of it before, that in American culture, Euro-American culture, if an individual had any African-American ancestry whatsoever, they were considered to be black. And of course, there were free blacks and slaves, but just being referred to as black and as a Negro in the language of the time, or more racist terms, one drop was all it took. And so Twain then writes a book for us about a slave woman, Roxy. His only work of literature really that focuses upon and builds an important character portrayal of a woman, the slave woman Roxy, who is 1/16 African American, or in the language of the time, mulatto. Yeah, and actually in New Orleans there were terms. Quadroon was 1/4. Octoroon was 1/8, and but Roxy was much less. She was 1/16. Yeah. Now she was a slave woman to Percy Driscoll, whose brother was Judge Driscoll, who we meet in the book later, and her baby was born of a white father, who we learn of later. And so that baby then, who was named Chambers, Valet de Chambers, that baby was 1/32nd.
Yeah.
Therefore, these individuals could do what in the 20th century language is called passing. They could pass for white, even though they were considered black.
Right.
And so at the same time, for Twain's literary purposes, dramatic purposes, at the same time that Roxy's baby Chambers was born, Percy Driscoll's and his wife also had a child, Tom, who was born simultaneously, but Tom's mother died soon thereafter from complications from childbirth. And so these two children were born almost at identically the same time, and they both appear to be white because one is only 1/32nd. Right. And so Roxy, the slave woman, to protect her son and to make sure that he's never sold down the river into slavery. And, she's a fierce mother. She's a fierce, protective mother, and she switches the babies to protect her son. And therefore, the black baby is raised as a white man, and the black child, and the white child is raised as a slavery, and because of the one drop rule, and the reader has to stretch the imagination somewhat here, but actually, this is not impossible. This could have happened, and so these children are switched. Now, does this sound familiar? Yeah, this is The Prince and the Pauper, also a book by Mark Twain, in which he resurrects the old European folktale of a child, but that book's about class. Right. It's about social class, not about race. Right. So he takes The Prince and the Pauper, which is about class, and he turns it into a book about race and what it would be like if a black child was raised white, and what what a white child would be like if he was raised black and experienced all. And so we could quit there or just think about that for the rest of your life. Well,
it's a really striking plot, and it fits, as you say, with his other book, Prince and the Pauper. And they both have a little bit of Twain gives a little bit of help, right? He says that it's not just that they happen to be the same age or same stature, so that in both cases, the two boys happen to look so similar, right? So that's the little bit of extra help that he gives. In one of the many really powerful passages, and it goes back to what you said about Roxy and this fully developed woman character. They touched on that in the Burns documentary too, and she is, she's just I think a really good depiction of a mother, as you said, because before she gets the idea to switch them, her first idea is just look, I can't bear the thought of my baby someday being a slave and then being sold down the river, right? And down the river is like down to hell. It's like the lower you go, the further you go, the worse it gets, right? Just like in Huck, right?
And that keeps coming back. It's a recurrent theme.
Yeah, it's like a gong that resounds in the novel over and over again, right? And so she's thinking, I'm going to kill my boy. That's what's in the best interest for my son. And then she says, but don't worry, I'm gonna go with you. So she's going to kill herself and her son for the sake of her son. Again, a situation that kind of recurs, right, later in the book. And then tell me if I remember it correctly, she puts on, like the nicest dress that she has. And then because it's appropriate, right, for the last thing you wear to be nice, right?
She's contemplating suicide in the beginning of the book.
And then she borrows some of the fine clothes from the rich white child for Chambers.
Yeah, right? So he can die in a nice outfit.
Yeah. And then if I remember correctly, when she sees him, she realizes I can barely tell them apart, right? And he knows that the mother of the white child is dead, and the father
doesn't care.
He's
not interested.
Yeah, he's interested in his land speculation, I think, is what's always going on. And so he can't, people have remarked, I could barely tell them apart. And that's when she has the idea. And then she does the old swap, right?
Oh, it's friggin' brilliant.
Yeah, it's high drama too, because, and she recognizes what she's doing because she's selling the white infant down the river. And she recognizes that, and she thinks it through, and she says things like, I can't, it breaks my heart to do that. But, this is what white folks do to black folks all the time. what's the difference, right? I've got to look out for my own.
One clarification here: the white child does not go down the river. The two boys are raised together, but that's a possibility. That's why she does it, because she's afraid that someday her son might be sold down river.
Figuratively speaking, she's selling him down.
And but now Twain even ups the ante. I mean, as if this ain't good enough. Okay, he even ups the ante because and this again is a product of the times, just like the one drop rule. He's very interested in the idea of nature and nurture, and that children are not. And this is also an anti-race to believe in nurture and that one is determined by their social environment, their characteristics, their shape, goes against the belief that some people are inferior and they're born that way, and and the blacks are inferior to whites, and therefore they're never going to advance. And so, just to up the ante and to really make this serious business, he has the black child, who is now called Tom, and we're going to call him Tom, even though his real name is Chambers. He has Tom spoiled by his father and his aunt, and they dote on him, and so he turns out to be a horrible, spoiled, selfish, egotistic, not because of his race, because of the way he was raised, because of his environment, and then the plot thickens because he turns out to be a thieving and murderous individual.
That was, there was a time, I'll put it this way, I've only read the book once. There are times when I read it and I start to, because I'm rooting for Twain, and you always root for your favorite authors to have your sensibility. So there are times when I start and I worry and I think, so is Tom a son of a bitch just because he was raised poorly? Or is there a little bit of, too much 19th century tucked in there? But no,
the
best evidence
I think that's
seems
a question
to be,
people would. I think they'd ask that today. Well, he's a racist, so therefore he makes
right.
But no,
but you don't think so,
it's
right?
because he's spoiled it, and he's raised by these idiots who turn him into a monster.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's the interpretation.
They send him to Yale, and he drops out, and he develops a gambling habit, anyway, that's my interpretation.
Well, and I think you're right. I think the weight of the evidence is that there are a couple lines that make me want to go back and look at it, but I think that's the bulk of it.
You know where I get this, Joe? This is Langston Hughes' interpretation, and I'm sorry to rely on criticism here, but I'm not smart enough to figure that out, the nature-nurture thing, okay? I actually read that in the introduction to Pudd'nhead Wilson and got thinking about it, and those of you who are listening, incidentally, if you get an edition of the book, actually, we're going to use the...
the one we're going to read from, just because, as people know from the two previous podcasts, I'm paranoid about copyright, and I don't really understand exactly what you can do or what you can do safely. And since we have zero budget here, maybe Patreon, but we have zero budget, I'm just steering clear of anything. So when we read from it, we'll just read the public domain Project Gutenberg edition. Everything that Twain published in his lifetime is long in public domain, and so that's what we'll read from. But
can I recommend it?
You can absolutely recommend it, because now you're just selling books for these guys. So you can show them the cover and say, if you want to get the Langston Hughes introduction, show them the, what is it, Bantam?
Yeah, and this is the standard edition. They own it. And Hughes was a Harlem Renaissance poet and prose stylist, and he's got a lot of good ideas about Pudd'nhead Wilson. And incidentally, I read this after I'd already read the book, which I always recommend. I said, read the book first, and then read criticism later.
Don't get steamrolled.
But I hadn't thought of that. This is a nature-nurture thing, which Twain was very, very interested in. Well, so you got race, and you also got nature and nurture, the one-drop rule. And finally, and this is the frosting on the cake, this book was published in the early 1890s, exactly at the time that a court case was working its way through the courts and eventually made it to the Supreme Court in 1896, called Plessy versus Ferguson, in which a black man who passed for white went on to a New Orleans railroad car and then eventually was kicked out, took the case to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled in favor of segregated railroad cars.
The famous, yeah, Plessy.
And that was a one drop rule situation. And so Twain's tapping into all of these currents of the time in writing Pudd'nhead Wilson.
Yeah.
And finally he taps into something that no one had ever heard of before, not very many people had heard of, called fingerprinting.
Yeah.
And which also developed in the late 19th century. And so Pudd'nhead Wilson, ironically, is kind of a mystery detective novel in which fingerprinting is used to solve the mystery of a crime. And a crime, as you no doubt surmise, that was committed by Tom, the Roxy's child who'd been raised up by Judge Driscoll.
Right. And so that Pudd'nhead Wilson is the Sherlock Holmes of the story, although typically
the title
Twainian version of Sherlock Holmes, right? He's considered Pudd'nhead is like knucklehead, right? So for the vast majority of the book, he is considered a knucklehead by all sorts of people who didn't get a joke he made a long time ago because he's just too subtle and ironic for them. And then finally, he collects these fingerprints, as Mike is saying, and people think he's just a crazy, wacky guy doing something that will never become or never be of any use. But of course, then we get to the trial, and boom, Pudd'nhead becomes a real life Sherlock.
And I hope we explained that okay, folks. You know, if I was teaching this in class at this point, I say, okay, now I know that's confusing. Are there any questions about what just happened? And we can't do that, okay? I hope we explained that okay. But I'll tell you what, it's worth reading, or even read a summary and then jump into it. But yeah, it's a detective book that uses the one drop rule and nature and nurture and fingerprinting all as plot devices to solve a crime, to solve a mystery.
I think we did all right. We'll find out. My one subscriber, my mom, will let me know how we did. She'll say wonderful. Okay, so what direction do you want to take it in now?
One thing I was thinking is I'd like to read something.
Yeah, good.
And then while I'm reading, you can think about what we're going to do next.
Okay, all right.
And what I'm going to read, I think, is pretty pedestrian. People think, well, what's he reading that part for? But it's a good example of how Twain uses words, and I think how he uses them pretty well. But also, there's a little twist to what I'm doing here. Hughes says at the beginning of Pudd'nhead Wilson starts out like a Hollywood movie because you see it's like the camera moves in on this little village, Dawson's Landing on the Mississippi River, and you see the setting for your story. And the first couple of pages, and it's going to take a while to get through this, describe this little village, and they do so, I think, in romantic terms, in idyllic terms. But don't grow too confident that Twain is clueless, okay, or romantic here.
No, we love to read from the books, right? One of the mottos is "Read at Joe's," right? So,
Chapter 1. The scene of this chronicle is the town of Dawson's Landing on the Missouri side of the Mississippi, half a day's journey per steamboat below St. Louis. In 1830, it was a snug little collection of modest 1- and 2-story frame dwellings whose whitewashed exteriors were almost concealed from sight by climbing tangles of rose vines, honeysuckles, and morning glories. Each of these pretty homes had a garden in front, fenced with white palings and opulently stocked with hollyhocks, marigolds, touch-me-nots, princess feathers, and other old-fashioned flowers, while on the windowsills of the houses stood wooden boxes containing moss rose plants and terracotta pots in which grew a breed of geranium whose spread of intensely red blossom accented the prevailing pink tint of the rose-clad house front like an explosion of flame. When there was room on the ledge outside of the pots and the boxes for a cat, the cat was there. In sunny weather, stretched full length, asleep and blissful, with her furry belly to the sun and a paw curved over her nose. Then that house was complete, and its contentment and peace were made manifest to the world by this symbol, whose testimony is infallible. A home without a cat, and a well-fed, well-petted, and properly revered cat may be a perfect home, perhaps, but how can it prove title? All along the streets on both sides at the outer edge of the brick sidewalk stood locust trees with trunks protected by wooden boxing, and these furnished shade for the summer and a sweet fragrance in spring when the clusters of buds came forth. The main street, 1 block back from the river and running parallel with it, was the sole business street. It was 6 blocks long, and in each block, 2 or 3 brick stories, 3 stories high, towered above interjected bunches of little frame shops. Swinging signs creaked in the wind the street's whole length. The candy-striped pole, which indicates nobility proud and ancient, along the palace-bordered canals of Venice, indicated merely the humble barber shop along the main street of Dawson's Landing. On a chief corner stood a lofty, unpainted pole, wreathed at the top, from top to bottom, with tin pots and pans and cups. The chief tinmonger's noisy notice to the world, when the wind blew, that his shop was on hand for business at that corner. The hamlet's front was washed by the clear waters of the great river, the Mississippi. Its body stretched itself rearward, up a gentle incline. Its most rearward border fringed itself out and scattered its houses about the baseline of the hills. The hills rose high, enclosing the town in a half-moon curve, clothed with forests from foot to summit. Steamboats passed up and down every hour or so. Those belonging to the little Cairo line and the little Memphis line always stopped. The big Orleans liners stopped for hails only or to land passengers or freight. And this was the case also with the great flotilla of transients. These latter came out of a dozen rivers: the Illinois, the Missouri, the Upper Mississippi, the Ohio, the Monongahela, the Tennessee, the Red River, the White River, and so on. And they were bound every whither and stocked with every imaginable comfort or necessity which the Mississippi communities could want, from the frosty falls of St. Anthony down through 9 climates, torrid New Orleans. Dawson's Landing was a slave-holding town with a rich slave work, grain, and pork country back of it. Now look what he just did here. And I know you're probably getting weary as we got on here, but I think it's a lovely portrait. And incidentally, it looks a little like one of the chapters in Life on the Mississippi, where he describes his hometown of Hannibal, Missouri, especially the crescent moon of the town. And if you've ever been to Hannibal, Missouri, you'll see that he's describing that town. Although certainly there are other Upper Mississippi River towns that look at it, but it's or look like it. But I think it's very nice, and I like it. I like it so much better because there's a little twist of the knife at the end.
Yeah.
Because that's over. That beautiful little description of that town and all that romance is over, because we're moving on now in the story. And it turns out Dawson's Landing was a slaveholding town with a rich slave work, grain, and pork country back of it. And so, here we go.
It's kind of a punch in the face, and I wonder how it came across to his readers, because I think my guess is the answer is it depended on the reader. But read that idyllic town and you think, what a beautiful place to grow up, and then you get that kind of that turn of the knife or the haymaker at the end. And I can imagine people in Twain's day, some people not batting an eyelash.
Oh yeah, so what?
But other people
so what?
Feeling something like the way a contemporary reader is likely to feel it.
Yeah, I think the book keeps working better and better as time goes on, to tell you the truth. Because of that kind of thing, and also because of the language, which it strikes us much harder than it did them. But some people wouldn't think anything about it. But to Twain, Twain was turning the knife there. He knew there was trouble. There's trouble in River City, if you will. Is that from The Music Man? Yeah, there's trouble right here in River City, and so watch out. And the plot thickens.
Well, it reminds me of some other things that I have seen in the way that you teach and the way that you tell stories. And I mentioned it before. Some certain resemblances between you and Mark Twain, Mike. You did both riverboat men, both
Well,
American.
I was a cook on the Mississippi,
That's
not,
right.
a,
He
not
was
a pilot.
Yeah, right. Well, we'll say you were both boatmen.
We
on the
both had
Mississippi.
3-year careers, though. You're right. I was on the Mississippi River for 3 years, and so was Mark Twain.
Yeah. You're both humorists, and one thing you both know, and I don't know if you learned this partly from him, is timing and pauses.
Yeah.
And what he does, I read a short story that you recommended called what was it? How to Tell a Story, I think.
Yeah.
So this is not How to Make a Book. That's from Mike and Huck, but How to Tell a Story is a short story, and he tells examples of stories at the end, but he also just talks about how to deliver one. And timing is everything.
And
right?
he starts out by telling a joke badly. We're talking about people who do not know how to tell a friggin' joke, which we all know. We all know those folks.
And laugh way too hard and blow the punchline and come out with it too early. So that's what he's doing at the beginning of Pudd'nhead Wilson, in part, right? Is he is kind of just he's kind of reeling you in little by little by little, right? There's an idyllic town and this
furry belly of the kitty cat.
Exactly. the joke about the cat proving title, or you proving title without a cat, and then at the end he gives you that jab, and it was a slave owning town.
Yeah, turns out there's some mean stuff going on in this town.
Yeah, right. So it's kind of that same undercurrent. Can't help but use river metaphors when you talk about Huck Finn, but in the story of Huck Finn that you don't see, at least not nearly to that degree, right, in Tom Sawyer. So that's when you kind of graduate from the boy's story to the Huck Finn
I'm always
story.
amazed that people think that Huck Finn is a children. You'll run into people who haven't read it, of course. Say, "Oh yeah, it's a children's book."
Right.
No,
Right.
It's not a children's book.
Right.
Oh my gosh! Don't give it to your 10-year-old. Okay, let them wait till they're in college.
Yeah, it's a good college book because you get into the kind of things that you should get into in college, or I don't know, maybe at the end of your high school career.
I think senior high school is fine, but it's serious business, and it's ugly business at times.
Well, one thing I kind of preach in my classes and Joe's great books too is that you have to read these old books, and you have to recognize that as you read them, there's going to be friction. And the metaphor I always use is that you're rubbing against these old books, your sensibility, your worldview, your politics, your morality, and you rub hard enough, or if the grain is hard enough, there's going to be heat, right? But there's also, I hope, going to be light, right? So when you read Huck Finn or Pudd'nhead Wilson, and you either are introduced to the one drop rule, or you're introduced to these terms, which, to me, I think they would sound kind of ugly even if I didn't know what they meant. Like, octoroon it has kind of a ponderous sound to it, right? And then you find out what it is, and then it kind of sinks in. You're like, you're learning about history, but then you're like, holy Toledo people divided themselves up that way. And when you read Pudd'nhead Wilson, you get kind of wrong-footed. I use a soccer metaphor for Anthony. You're going to call
you can call Chambers Tom, and you can call Tom Chambers because that's who they become.
Right, but you have to kind of rewire your circuits, even though it's only been a couple of pages, since you found out what their names were in the first place. And so you kind of work through that. And there's a beautiful scene too not a beautiful scene. It's a beautifully written scene, but it's actually a horrible scene where Roxy, the mother, she starts to live the lie. So she dresses her own son, Chambers, up as Tom, and then she says, I have to practice. I've got to start practicing treating him as if he is the white child of my owner, because if I slip up, I give up the game, then he and I both are going to be sold down the river, right? So she practices, and she says in this passage, and it was astonishing to me, and I'm not even going to try to quote it. I'll just paraphrase it. It was astonishing to Roxy how quickly she started to treat her own boy, Tom, as if he were a white boy, and how deferential and how kind of sycophantic and praising, and it wrongfoots her. And then she realizes how she's starting to treat the white boy, whom she has now renamed and re-identitied as Chambers, how she starts to treat that boy with contempt, neglect, disrespect, because after all, he's just a slave. And then you work hard to get the names straight, and then you stop and you think, wait a minute, holy the difference, like this is, Tom is the black baby and Chambers is now the white baby. And then you realize the difference in blood or genetics or identity and race is so slender, right? That nowadays we probably, wouldn't even occur to most people to notice. But it means all the difference in the world. And especially when you get to the end of the story, it's that, that one drop rule. It changes lives. It turns them upside down. And it's if you eschew these books, you don't read these books, it doesn't smack you. They don't smack you in the face, right? So you have to read books that smack you in the face. And Pudd'nhead Wilson smacks you in the face.
I want to put one thing in for the listener who hasn't read this book. Tom, well,
the real Tom?
Yeah. No. The
Roxy's
the 132nd
right.
boy, Tom, who's raised as a white child, doesn't know that Roxy is his mother until he's a grown man.
Right. And he treats her
horribly.
Awfully.
He treats her as a white child would treat a slave in a family like that.
Right.
And so it's just, but it also makes the moment when he is informed who he really is by Roxy.
Yeah.
Indignantly. It also makes that moment more delicious because he is ruined.
Yeah, and that is the passage that I have referred to a couple times now, that I think is like the hardest punch in the face. And so I'm going to go ahead and read that. And this is the passage in which the N word is used, as I would say, I would put it as a kind of ugly poetry. So when we first started thinking about doing this podcast, I had planned just not to use the N word at all. I mean, I would say N word, but I wouldn't actually say the word. But then I hadn't read Pudd'nhead Wilson, or I had started, but I hadn't read it all the way through. And I got into it, and then I got to this passage.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, look, you cannot read the real story as Twain wrote it and as it punches you in the face unless you actually speak the word. And so I definitely wanted to err on the side of not, making a splash or just trying to use the word just to prove that I could. Because as people have watched, the full history of Joe's Great Books, two episodes. No, I do think that this kind of approach to learning is predicated on free speech and free thought and all that. And so that, I try not to overdo it with trigger warnings or being too genteel or, by bowdlerizing the text, right? Which is what the 2011 Huck Finn does, which is to rewrite it to make it acceptable to contemporary sensibility. It shouldn't be acceptable to your contemporary sensibility. If it is, either you're a rabid racist or you're not learning it. You're not getting the full brunt of it. So I'm going to read this passage. And if you don't want to hear it, that's perfectly all right. Fast forward probably 2-3 minutes just to make sure that you miss it. But I'm going to use the actual word. And I'm going to try to do it, as I said before, in a monotone. I'm going to try not to get into character. But although this is actually completely Tom's voice, that is the boy who was born to Roxy's child, 132nd, black. But he is at this moment, the moment that Mike just talked about. He's just finding out that, in fact, he is black and that he is a slave. It's a powerful moment. Just to preface it, it's like, and I'm teaching ancient Greek tragedy this summer. It's summer of 2021 right now, and we just finished reading Oedipus the King. And if you've read Oedipus the King, there's this moment at the end of the story where he realizes who he is, and in that story, he's done some horrible, horrible things. In Pudd'nhead Wilson, the punch in the face doesn't have anything to do with behavior. It doesn't have anything to do with what Tom has done. It has only to do with who Tom is, and he's just realizing it. So here's the passage. For days he wandered in lonely places, thinking, trying to get his bearings. It was new work. If he met a friend, he found that the habit of a lifetime had in some mysterious way vanished. His arm hung limp instead of involuntarily extending the hand for a shake. It was the nigger in him asserting its humility. Now, Twain uses quotation marks in this passage for the N-word, but not in the rest of the book. To continue, and he blushed and was abashed, and the nigger in him was surprised when the white friend put out his hand for a shake with him. He found the nigger in him involuntarily giving the road on the sidewalk to a white rowdy and loafer. When Rowena, a girl that Tom has been interested in, the dearest thing his heart knew, the idol of his secret worship, invited him in, the nigger in him made an embarrassed excuse and was afraid to enter and sit with the dread white folks on equal terms. The nigger in him went shrinking and skulking here and there and yonder, and fancying it saw suspicion and maybe detection in all faces, tones, and gestures. If I didn't make it clear, Tom knows who he is, but it's still a secret. Just he and Roxy know the truth. Back to the quote. So strange and uncharacteristic was Tom's conduct that people noticed it and turned to look after him when he passed on. And when he glanced back, as he could not help doing in spite of his best resistance, and caught that puzzled expression in a person's face, it gave him a sick feeling, and he took himself out of view as quickly as he could. He presently came to have a hunted sense and a hunted look, and then he fled away to the hilltops and the solitudes. He said to himself that the curse of Ham was upon him. End of the passage. So when I read that first time, just a couple days ago, it seems to me that word takes on almost a sacred status, and it's like gong, 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 and nowadays it's got to be as potent as it ever was. As you said, the book gets more effective as it goes, or as time goes on, because it's an ugly term, but it's a potent term, and I think it's good to read it. So I'm going to go back to N-word if we ever have occasion to talk about it. But with this passage, just aside from, again, a kind of awful beauty, it has that just that it generates on its own, but it also goes back to, you could say, the beginning of Western lit, because it goes biblical, right?
Yeah. The curse of Ham.
The curse of Ham. So let me tell you, or just tell you what I can see about Genesis, and if you have anything to say about the curse of Ham, that would be great. I know a tiny bit, but I'll bet you know it better. When he says, when he thought people saw him, and found out his secret, in other words, saw the real him, what he really was, he took himself out of view. I'm quoting it again now. As quickly as he could, he presently came to have a hunted sense, a hunted look, and then he fled away to the hilltops and the solitudes. To me, that is Genesis. Genesis, after Adam and Eve eat from the forbidden tree. And it's just such a marvelous moment, a marvelous mythical expression of shame, because the first thing they want to do is to cover themselves up. If you remember Genesis, if you don't, or you haven't read it, it'd take you like 2 minutes to go read Genesis, 1 through 4, but you could just focus on 3. They eat from the tree. They have disobeyed God. They've done wrong. They have lost goodness, and they have gained evil in this one act. And what knowledge do they get from the tree? Knowledge that they're naked. And so what's the first thing they do once they know that they're naked? They were naked the whole time through, right? But it's only now that they recognize it. And they feel shame, and they feel the need to cover themselves up. It seems to me, exactly what Tom is feeling here, right? It's this deep, overwhelming sense of shame. And it turns his whole life upside down. He can't even hold out his hand for a handshake to a white person. The idea of going to his wannabe wife's house and actually accepting the invitation inside, all of these things. He starts to shrink away from people if he has the right of way on a path, right, to some guy that he would have considered a lowlife before. So the way you would put it in the Christian tradition is he is fallen, right? He has gone from pre-lapsarian Tom, which meant white Tom, to post-lapsarian Tom, which is black Tom. And well, in a way, he kind of recovers and goes back to being the same old guy he is.
Yeah, I want to say a couple things.
Yeah, jump in.
No, but I don't want to.
No, that was the bulk of it.
No,
so
that was good.
Jump in. I do want to hear about the curse of Ham.
I hadn't thought about a lot of that. Certainly not the biblical connection. But we read the passage last night, and I was struck by it even more. And I was thinking about what you said earlier, and what a lot of people say about Huck Finn is, all right, then I'll go to hell. That moment.
Yeah, yeah, right.
This is the moment. This is the moment in Pudd'nhead Wilson in a very different way.
Yeah,
in a very different. This is the moment in Pudd'nhead Wilson when if you'll excuse me, when the shit hits the fan.
Yeah.
But, and this is my second point, Tom is so he's so screwed up, and he's such a bad person that this doesn't last. This doesn't last.
Right.
He goes back to his and he tries to figure out how he's going to somehow keep his lifestyle, and how he's going to survive all of this, and also how he's going to avoid being accused of murder and being convicted of.
And we may end up spoiling the plot later, which is okay. And that actually is another subject that if we have time, and we'll come back to. We were talking about the tension and the different ways you can maintain or increase suspense or tension in a book, even though very early on in Pudd'nhead Wilson, we know certain things are going to happen, right? And even if we're not told explicitly, we can tell, right?
It's not a mystery novel for the reader. The reader knows who committed the crime. Has a pretty good idea who committed the crime.
Right. So I might as well just bring that point in real quick. Again, it goes back to the class I'm teaching on ancient Greek tragedy. In ancient Greece, if you went to a tragedy, it was a communal, religious, political, civic, everything, social event. But it was about your faith. It was about your religion. And so almost every story was drawn from their faith. And so, of course, they knew what happened, right? It would be like going to, a very biblically oriented society and putting on a play about the Bible. Well, people know what's going to happen, and you better not change it. But nowadays, it seems to me, in the age of movies especially, we just love to be surprised, right? We love to, not to know how it's going to turn out. And, people go to great lengths to keep you in suspense. I mean, like the stuff that Marvel did for Endgame after Infinity Wars to keep it quiet. Amazing that they pulled it off, in my opinion. They just didn't want anybody to know, because it's all about being surprised. And that's where the suspense comes from. But in a way, Twain is like the ancient Greeks in that he doesn't care so much if you know what's going to happen. He builds the tension in moments like this. It's kind of like, you feel something like the way Tom feels, that you think, when is it going to happen, right? When are people going to find out? How are we going to get from the beginning X to the end X, right? How are we going to move to that end? And so you get suspense in different ways.
Before we finish, there is a wonderful surprise, and it's not who killed the judge.
Driscoll, right.
There is a wonderful surprise, and make sure we don't get out of this interview without me talking about that just for a second.
Okay, Anthony, help us remember, because I'll forget as soon as I finish this sentence. Wonderful surprise.
Yeah, and I haven't used that modifier "wonderful" yet, because and given the tone of the last 10 or 15 minutes, you would think wonderful. There's nothing wonderful going on here, but actually, there's quite an ending. There's quite an ending.
Well, wonderful, and you're right. The thing is, the way this tells something about our society. I'm putting on my linguistics hat, even though I'm not trained in it. But the words admire and wonder and awesome, right? All those are almost purely positive in the way we use them, especially awesome. It's like would you like to have a drink of water? And you'd say, that would be awesome, right? It's just like this really watered down, so to speak, use of these terms. But awesome comes from awe and wonder.
Yeah, like awful.
Right, exactly. Awful. What it means is jaw dropping, like you behold it. Yeah. And it's awesome. And that's why I use that term awful about that passage. It fills you with awe, because it's so striking. And it is also a beautiful passage, despite the fact that it's talking about something ugly. So I forget where we went, except that I did want to get back to the Curse of Ham. So how fresh are you on that?
You're the biblical guy, Joe. I'm not even going to go there. But I hadn't thought about it much, and I was really glad that I was really glad we went through it last night and read this, because I'd forgotten about that.
Okay, so neither of us is expert on it then, but I do know that it's a story about Noah, right? And there was a story about Noah that did not have to do with the flood and the ark, but it's this strange story where Noah gets drunk and he ends up naked and sleeping and exposed. So passes out drunk and naked. And one of his sons, Ham, sees him naked and he looks. Now, then his other two sons, I forget what their names are, Japheth, I think, is one, and the other guy, I'll dub it in later. They do the respectful thing. So keep this in mind, Anthony, for next time I'm drunk and naked out on the street. They walk backwards, like they each hold a sheet on one side of him and back up over him and kind of lay the sheet down over dear old drunk and naked Noah. And that is the respectful thing to do. Now, as is true for almost every biblical story, especially ones like this that kind of capture the imagination, partly because they're weird. You wonder what the heck is going on about it. There are all sorts of different interpretations about what it means, and is it symbolic or is it just literal? And it seems to me that probably it works on the literal level as well as on all sorts of different levels. The literal level is just you respect your father even if he's behaving like a fool, and you cover him up, right? And so you see how it's almost the same story as the story of the fall of Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit, right? That Noah has done something. He has done something wrong. He's behaved badly, and he's ended up naked. Now, he's not conscious of it because he's drunken himself to sleep. But what is the duty of a good son? The duty of a good son is to cover over his father's shame. It is not to, look it in the eye, so to speak, and not try to make up for it, right? So if you can't tell, Butch, this is the point. All of my shames you have to remedy, right? You have to hide them, especially from the IRS. So that's the moment you get to, or that Tom gets to when he recognizes who he is. Now, one little bit that, and I won't talk about it in any detail because I don't want to give the impression that I'm an expert in it. And, biblical history and the history of biblical interpretation is, a couple of careers that I'll never get to. But what this passage has been used for over the years, and I think there is probably, a real historical truth to it. Ham is the ancestor of the Canaanites. And the Israelites and the Canaanites, ancient Hebrews, were warring for Palestine, right, with the Canaanites who were there by the time the Israelites came back from their captivity in Egypt. And so quite a lot of biblical scholars think that the essence of the story, the seed of the story, is that whoever wrote that story was trying essentially to slander the Canaanites. This has been spun out over the years into a justification for slavery.
Yeah.
And I don't know what came first, but you can imagine they came at about the same time. That the idea, even though apparently it's not mentioned anywhere in Genesis, was that, Ham was dark-skinned. Ham was black.
It's a literal misreading of the Bible that was used by the slaveholding class to show that biblically slavery was God's will, and that there was and approved.
Yeah.
And this was evidence. It was used as evidence, and
Right.
And you're right. There's not that much there to go with.
No, there wasn't, but it was handy, wasn't it? It was a handy tool to make.
Both sides used the Bible to say they were right, but in this case, it's a literal misreading of the Bible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and over the centuries, the Christians and Jews and anybody who reads the Bible, people of the book, they have noticed that there are these really striking stories, and there's a lot of what I call blank space. And it's like you get these stories, and the one I always talk about is God appeared to Abraham and told him to go sacrifice his son on the top of Mount Moriah, period. I think that's verse 2. And then verse 3 begins, and so the next morning, Abraham saddled up his ass and took his son and took wood for the sacrifice and began to ascend Mount Moriah. And you're like, whoa, what happened between that period and the beginning of the first, or the first letter of the next sentence, right? There's a whole modern novel of about 800 pages in between those two little bits of type. And so what seems to me to have happened over the years is that people who were devout and who knew the Bible inside and out, your imagination, you can't hold it back from diving into that little space, right, and opening it up. And out of that kind of space, you get, whole works, like Paradise Lost, you could say, is doing that over and over again, just interpolating, full stories into these little gaps. So unfortunately, although you get beautiful stories like that, artistic interpolations like you do with Milton. You also get some of the ugly, where people they can insert a justification for an evil practice or for their own power. Right? Apparently, that's what they did.
And getting back to Huck Finn, because everything gets back to Huck Finn,
As always,
absolutely,
right?
as Hemingway said.
Right.
Huck has been taught the story of Ham. He's been taught that he's been taught the biblical defense of slavery.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And I'm kind of wandering around here.
No, this is the way it's supposed to go.
So anyway, Twain's interested in that story, and
yeah. Well, that's one question I have, and I don't know Twain well enough. I don't know if you do or not. I'm sure a lot of people have studied him and drawn their conclusions. But I mean, we know that he obviously knew the Bible, right? And that there's one charming anecdote from the Burns thing, as without trying to summarize it awkwardly or poorly, Twain suffered a lot toward the end of his life, and he lost a lot of loved ones. They died before he did, most of them. And his most important loved ones died, his wife and his daughter. And so, he came increasingly to doubt his faith, and there was a lot of people that were doing a really bad job probably of practicing it around him. And so there's some woman who, when he's at the apex of his fame, comes up to him after a talk or something and says, "Oh, Mark Twain, the dear Lord must just love you to pieces," something like that. And he just nods and says, "Thank you very much." And she walks off, and there's still a crowd, and he says something like, "She must not know that we've fallen out, or that we're not on the best of terms anymore," something like that. So I remember, do you want to jump in?
No.
There's that story I didn't have a chance to reread, but there's it's, what did we figure out? The man who corrupted Hadleyburg.
Yeah.
Guy comes into a town and corrupts the town. In this town that had seemed to be full of good people, quite readily falls to his wiles and to especially a sense of greed, right? Do I remember it correctly?
Yeah, they become greedy.
And it just seemed to me when I read that way back when, like 30 years ago when I was a student, that it seemed like Twain had become like this angry God of Genesis, angry God who destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah because he couldn't find 10 good people or 10 good individuals in that town. That's it's kind of a joke that of all the people in Sodom and Gomorrah, there couldn't have been more than 9 good ones. It seems like Twain, was kind of just, calling down fires from heaven at the end of his life. And so it's kind of it's a very sad thing, isn't it? It's like he lived out a kind of tragedy because he was too compressed, I think, by the life that he lived or that he was surrounded by.
Yeah, well, he had a lot of. We haven't really talked about Twain today himself. Personally, we talked about his writing and how he wrote and that sort of thing, but we haven't done any kind of biographical, which is fine. But you start out by saying that he obviously knew the Bible pretty well, and he knew Don
Quixote.
and he was, he had very little formal education.
Yeah.
They were poor, or his father lost. They were kind of aspiring and had held a middle class status, but his father lost everything, just as he would lose his fortune twice. And so he had no formal or very little formal education. He never went to high school, or what we would call high school, and he certainly never went to college.
Yeah.
And so, but he really knew a lot. and that's also very democratic. He's now many of these New England authors of the time, contemporaries of Twain, who were in Boston and the New England states, Longfellow and Whittier and Dana and the Boston Brahmins, they all had degrees from Harvard.
Right.
They were all college men, and so he was he brought a coarse and untutored way to American literature, and none of them could write in vernacular. Some of them Cooper tried, and it was painful.
I'll bet, because he didn't live that, right?
It was painful. And so Twain democratized American literature, and he received honorary degrees, but he sure as hell never went to college.
Oh, right. We laughed last night about how he got an honorary degree from Oxford, and how I can't remember what it was. This is all from the Burns documentary, and he said something like, "Well, I love the welcome and I love the respect, but boy, I love the clothing." He's wearing this floppy mortarboard.
Yeah, great outfit.
Well, what you just said, if we took out the name Twain, it would have been a perfect description for kind of the social status and the kind of mindset that we at least speculate another great author had, namely Shakespeare. Right? Shakespeare. Some
Good.
people still.
Touche.
Well, this is a funny thing here because Shakespeare is, as some people probably know, a lot of people just don't believe that Shakespeare was Shakespeare, or that Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, the kid from Podunk, Stratford, might as well be from Yuba City or something, that he could possibly have written, or from Ruston, Anthony, that he could possibly have,
Or River City.
or Ellensburg, that he could have written these magnificent works of art, because after all, he didn't go to the good schools. He wasn't from London. He was just from Stratford upon the Avon, wherever the hell that is, right? And so when he first starts making it big, there's some guy named, I think Robert Greene. I was forgetting if it's Robert or Thomas, which is, I hope I never remember, because it just shows you who won. He was an Oxford educated sort, and he scorns Shakespeare and says, who is this guy? And he kind of mocks him and calls him an upstart crow because he didn't do things the right way, which was in the aristocratic way. Well, Shakespeare essentially did it the democratic way. I like to think Shakespeare did it the good old-fashioned American way. And he worked his way up and got his father a coat of arms. And so he essentially arted his way and then purchased his way into the lesser gentility, right? Which is something that was important to him. And you can see that in Twain quite a lot, right? He's got a chip on his shoulder that he doesn't come from, blue blood, and that his art is somehow lowly. But Twain actually writes a whole book arguing that Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare. he favors Bacon, right?
Yeah.
Of all the different characters in history that could have written Shakespeare, Francis Bacon is one. When I talk about Shakespeare, I'll tell more about this because it's pretty funny. But it's kind of ironic. He, sold out his own, sold Shakespeare down the river.
Twain was torn. He was of two minds. He was from the Midwest, the Upper Mississippi River Valley. He aspired to create great art. He met some, not all of his goals, and he immediately moved to New England. And initially upstate New York and then Connecticut. Even though he democratized high culture, he somehow wanted the connections and the respect that comes with that.
Yeah.
And so he never lived in Missouri.
And the wealth too, right?
People say, "Oh yeah, he was a Mississippi River pilot." Yeah, for 3 years. He never went, and he always said, "I've never loved any job more than I love being on." Well, yeah. Then how come you didn't go back and do that again?
Right.
Well, shit, he didn't want to do that, and so he was.
It was like earning your living.
He was torn between high culture and low culture, and he chose to live and create a life for himself and his family in Hartford, Connecticut, and among the New England Brahmins, who he had turned upside down. And I know we're running out of time. I told you a story last night, and I hope I can do it justice, because I think it's a little it's a little murky. But Twain went to New England when he got money, and he was invited to Boston to speak for one of the supper clubs of these Brahmins, these high artists with Harvard degrees, who include Longfellow, for example, John Greenleaf Whittier. Maybe you don't know all these names, but Richard Henry Dana, and other New England greats, literary greats. Hawthorne comes to mind. And so he went to Boston, and he was invited to give the dinner address. And he came up with this outrageous idea that he would tell a story that involved all these individuals, all these poets and writers. And the story would be set in a frontier cabin in the Sierra Mountains, which, of course, where he set Jumping Frog of Calaveras in the mining camp there. And that all of these great New England writers would be arguing with each other over who was the best, and as the story develops, they get into a knife fight with each other, and so it turns into a frontier brawl of New England literary greats. And he thought this was funny. Obviously, he thought it was hilarious, or he wouldn't have done it. And it didn't go over that good. There was embarrassed laughter. There was awkwardness. There was no response to the punchlines, and so it ended very uncomfortably because they'd invited him to show that they respected his work, even though he turned everything they'd been doing upside down. And then they felt that he'd insulted them, and he had.
Well, he probably did it on purpose. There's a detail. Let's see, what is it? A couple details, and the stuff I get from Twain and his biography, I got from Ken Burns' documentary the last couple of days. He says, I am a man of Missouri morals, but Connecticut culture.
I remember that.
He says, and that makes me, the perfection of humanity, something like that. Because I'm the perfect man, right? And he also talks about I'm not an American, I am the American. So he kind of strutted towards the end, right? Oh, yeah. And it fits.
And he finished up in New York City, and probably lived there 20 years towards the end, in a very nice townhouse, and evidently dressed up in his old age, dressed up in the white suit, and went out on Sunday just to walk around so everyone would see him.
I heard that, yeah.
And, so he could be so was it Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens walking around?
Yeah.
It was Mark Twain. Samuel Clemens was, he built a mansion in Hartford, Connecticut for his family and wanted to be part of that. But Mark Twain was blowing it up. He was the guy who was blowing all of that up.
I had read a biography way back when I studied him as an undergrad, and I had forgotten, or maybe I didn't read what I was supposed to read, but I didn't realize how much he loved money, how much he loved wealth, and what a prodigal spender he was.
He was a disaster.
And and the identity thing was fascinating too. And I forget which daughter it was, but his favorite, the one that died, right? Was it Susie?
Yeah.
She said, I hate that name, Mark Twain, right? And I want my dad to be known for the great author he is. He's not just funny, he's profound. I want him to be known as Samuel Langhorne Clemens, right? I almost said Longhorn. But what he did, and I love it in those moments when he kind of rubs it in, like he did, as you were describing. When he did what, like, some of the greatest authors ever have done. I mean, you think of authors that are, especially the ones that are capable of writing just an elevated language, and they deliberately don't do it. Dante, I mentioned him before. He knew Latin, and that was the scholarly language of his day, and so he could have just written the Divine Comedy in Latin. But instead, he wrote it in the vernacular. He wrote it in vulgar, that is low-class Italian, which is just the regular old Italian that everybody spoke, right? But he wasn't showing off. He wrote it in regular, ordinary Italian, and he also wallowed in the vulgarity. You go to Jonathan Swift, and he loved to wallow in the vulgarity. Cervantes, for sure. And Shakespeare, I mean, for God's sakes, read Shakespeare. And I mean, you can't go two lines without some sort of vulgar inside joke that, most of which we miss nowadays, right? But and so Twain does the same thing, and he talks in the vernacular. And again, it's not the theme too hard, but that's the whole principle of the podcast, is that anybody can read. It's ratatouille for literature, for God's sake. And so, I'm really happy that we talked about good old Mark Twain and Pudd'nhead Wilson and Huck Finn.
I thought it was pretty good.
I thought it was great. I was going to bring in a little. Well, in fact, let me just finish with one little thing about Shakespeare. There are two plays that, in some way, are kind of lurking. Two Shakespeare plays are kind of lurking under Pudd'nhead Wilson and Huck Finn, and they're the two plays that are most explicitly about race: Othello and the Merchant of Venice. And Othello, of course, about black versus white, and Merchant of Venice about, well, religion, but still something kind of the intersection of race and religion with the Jewish character Shylock and the Italian Christians with whom he comes into conflict. And one thing I'll just point out, the only thing and I haven't looked it up yet, so somebody's probably already figured it out if it is a connection, but shortly after that passage I read where Dom realizes who he is, and over again he talks about himself as an N-word, as a slave. And he says at one point, he is white, talking about the uncle, the man that is not actually his uncle, but who everyone thinks is his uncle, Driscoll. And he says, he is white, and I am his chattel, his property, his goods, and he can sell me just as he could his dog. And roughly in the same area, I'm I'm splicing passages together shamelessly. He withdraws from a certain society, and it reads as follows. Tom said he was not well and left the table. And so the black-white distinction, obviously, that fits with Othello. And if you read Othello, I'll do a podcast on Othello in the future. The way I think of it, the way I interpret it, it's interpretable in more than one way, is that Othello is a tragedy in part because the racism from the outside eventually creeps into the mind of the main character, Othello. So not the only way of reading it, but one way of reading it. And it seems to me that's what happens with, you see that happen with Tom when he kind of switches back intellectually. You see that with Roxy repeatedly in the passage, where suddenly she's deferential to the white baby, but contemptuous of the black baby. But with Merchant of Venice, the way it works is the Jewish character at the end, Shylock, is defeated. In his last lines, he asks permission from the Duke, the main power of Venice. He asks if he can leave, and he says, "I'm not well," and he has been forced to convert. So it's a very small line, little snippet, but I wouldn't put it past Twain to be kind of ringing that bell, right? And that's one of the other things that's so fun when you read a bunch of literature from the Western tradition, is that you begin to see these connections, these echoes, these resonances, and sometimes it's deliberate, and the author knows exactly what he's doing. Sometimes it's kind of you've injected it into your bloodstream, right? And Shakespeare's in Twain's bloodstream as the European tradition expands to embrace American literature as well.
Well, I learned a lot this afternoon.
I really appreciate you coming, man. Thanks for all the knowledge and for rowing the boat today. And you got to come back. Come back.
Well, yeah.
Awesome. We'll leave a trail of mojos from Ellensburg all the way to Ruston.
Yeah, this is rough. Sitting around talking about books. Yeah, okay, I can do this.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Podcast 4 topic remains to be determined, but it'll be just as good as podcasts 1, 2, and 3. See ya. Closing credits.